Hi, everybody. My name is Yvette with Brown Capital Realty. Today, we're going to go over the Florida as is contract. My hopes is to get through the contract within 5 minutes. So this will be a very quick training session for you. So you can find the as is contract in Form Simplicity. Read this information. I was actually putting it earlier. It's taking up my time, unfortunately. So hopefully I get this done in 4 minutes. Okay, so let's go. Seller's information. Buyer's information. The address. Please be advised that it's not a specific address. It's just an address that I just thought of on the top of my head. County. This is the property tax ID. The property tax ID number can be found on the county's property appraiser's website. The legal description can also be found on the property appraiser's website. Next section is personal property. That is included. Section E is personal property that is excluded. Please keep in mind that this is not going to be this way in every transaction. You have to change the information to reflect your particular transaction. Purchase price. Down payment. When is the down payment going to be made? I'm just going to put 3 days here, but you can leave it blank and it will still be 3 days. This is the escrow agent's information. This section here, if there's any additional deposit that's going to be made. And when, I'm going to leave it blank to indicate 10 days. Section C is financing, put 95%. Once I put 95%, you see in section E, it automatically calculates what the balance the buyer has to close. Section 3, time for acceptance. Today's July 14th, so I'm just going to say by July 18th. Closing date. I will put August 18th. 1 month. This section here is check if the property is subject to lease or occupancy after closing. If it's not subject to lease, or if it's not going to be occupied by the current buyer or the tenant during closing, you do not check this section. In regards to assignability, the first one says may assign and thereby be released from any further liability, which means the buyer can assign the contract and be released under any terms of this contract. The second one says may assign but not be released from liability, which means that the buyer can assign this contract, but that person is still liable under this contract. And the third one is may not assign this contract. If no box is checked, then the buyer may not assign this contract. Most sales is that they may not assign this contract. That's not all. Financing. So like section A is cash, B is contingent upon receiving a loan. So I'm going to put this contract is contingent upon within, I typically leave this blank. I'll just put 30 days, which means the same thing. After effective, which is a loan period, by obtaining a loan approval of a conventional loan, I did put 5% on the first page, fixed rate. But listen, this depends on what kind of loan they have. They may have a fixed, they may have adjustable, or you can say fixed or adjustable rate, which basically means that Whether they receive a loan that has a fixed rate or adjustable rate, they still want to proceed with this contract. So this section here says it's in regards to the interest rate. And it says the interest rate not to exceed. You can put an amount here or you can leave it blank. If you leave it blank, it basically states that if left blank, then prevailing rate based upon buyer's creditworthiness. So they can end up with a 6% or 7%, they still want to move forward. Or they can have a 3 or 4%, which would be excellent. And of course, they will want to move forward. And for the term, if left blank, 30 years. I typically leave all of that blank. Buyer shall make application, if left blank, then 5 days. I typically leave that blank as well. This section here is if the buyer is going to have an assumption of existing mortgage or purchase money note and mortgage to seller. This section here is in regards to the closing costs and the fees paid by both the buyer and the seller. This is who is going to designate the closing agent and pay for owner's policy. Miami-Dade and Broward is typically the one that's typically chosen. Typically leave that blank. This is in regards to home warranties. This is in regards to special assessments. And this does not include the condominium HOA assessments, it's public body assessments. Typically, if I'm representing the buyer, I always check B, seller shall pay in full prior to or at time of closing any assessments allowed by the public body to be prepaid. And if I'm representing the seller, I put seller shall pay installments due prior to closing and buyer shall pay installments due after closing. But I mean, it also depends on whether or not there's a special assessment. I really haven't had a lot of files where there was a public body special assessment. This year I typically leave blank, 20 days. This is an inspection period. You leave it blank, it's 15 days, but if you're representing the buyers, most sellers will not allow you to have the home waiting for a cancellation period for 15 days. Scroll down. So this section is in regards to any addendums that needs to be included with this as is contract. So if it's a condominium, you have to add the condominium rider. If there's a HOA, you add the homeowners association. Depending on the financing, if it's FHA, you do FHA VA financing. If it's conventional appraisal contingency, if you don't add a appraisal contingency, then the contract is not based upon appraisal, which could be a huge issue if the property does not appraise. Homes that were built prior to 1978, you check this, and so on and so forth. So read through these addendums and see if you need to add any of them. Here you can add any special additional terms, and you add the cooperating sales associate and the listing sales associate. And that is it for the as is contract.